Firstly, thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and I'm going to try and discuss with you tonight depression in the 3 ages of the brain, which is an area which I'm very interested in, how we change throughout our lifetime. So I'm going to explain what the 3 ages of the brain are. I'm going to go through what is major depression and a brief review of its treatment. And then I'm going to have a discussion really on the differences in the causes, presentation and treatment throughout these 3 phases. Because I think in some ways we forget that depression is a condition which can affect us at different stages of our lives for different reasons. So just a brief tour of the brain. Some people who may have heard me talk before, so bear with me, but this is just to give you an idea of how the brain works. Well, the brain is around 1 billion neurons and about 9 billion helper cells. So we have each neuron is attached to each other, but there are the most extraordinary number of connections between them all, between around 40,000 and 1 million connections, sometimes from one neuron to multiple other neurons. So the brain is up to 50 to 100 trillion connections. So sometimes I think we human beings take our brains for granted. This is one of the most extraordinary plastic organs that we have. And in some ways, the number of connections is almost beyond our comprehension. So it's no wonder that we get into difficulties at varying times in our lives. Now, these neurons form key pathways, and these pathways traverse our brain, performing all the crucial activities of our lives. But from our purpose, we're really interested in those connected to mental health, and they are the connections between our emotional and logical brain. And a key thing is that our brain has the ability, which we call neuroplasticity, which is to expand or shrink the number of connections, which in turn can change the pathways. And it's this magical plasticity which is present throughout our whole lives, which is how we change our thoughts, emotions and behaviour. So it's really, really important in terms of how we function. And it's really important to understand that this process is going out through all of our lives, particularly through the 3 ages of the brain. And this is a key thing. Neurons that fire together wire together. In other words, the more often we do something, the stronger the connections in our brain get. So for example, if we get very anxious, the more anxious we get, the more the connections get stronger. So they get stronger and stronger and stronger. So that's why we get into difficulties. Neurons that fire apart wire apart. So in other words, the less we use of something, the weaker it gets. So for example, if we begin to get some assistance in dealing with panic attacks, for example, we can suddenly find that these pathways are beginning to weaken and suddenly we're not having as much trouble at all. Use it or lose it is an absolutely key thing. In other words, the brain is only interested in practical everyday stuff. So if we're not using stuff for a long period of time, then it begins to drop away and pathways get quite weak. So this is the key thing, that the mind is a function of the living brain. And we all have an emotional and logical brain and an emotional and logical mind. And most psychological illness are due to a breakdown in communication between these 2 brains. So this in some ways is the most important slide we'll see tonight. And as you can see, you have a logical brain at the front and an emotional brain in the middle. So the logical brain is situated at the front of the brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex and makes up around 1/3 of the brain. This is our rational, logical, problem-solving part of the brain. It helps us to be creative, to analyse situations and plan situations. The key thing, it's in charge of our emotions and behaviour. Very important, it's in charge of our behaviour, because any impulsive, self-destructive, suicidal thoughts or behaviours come from this part of the brain. And it's crucial as well in all our social relationships and in empathy, which is how we relate to another emotionally. So you can see the emotional brain is in the middle of the brain. It's in charge of our stress system. It has a key function in how we process emotions though. All emotions, particularly the negative ones like anxiety, depression, but also ones like joy. It's crucial in the creation, storage and retrieval of memories. So this part of the brain, a part of this part of the brain when it goes down is why we get Alzheimer's. And it's involved in how we enjoy food, sex and alcohol. And I always say our young people are experts in this part. Which arrow is bigger? Yeah, I think this is a really important one here, because if you notice, the arrow coming from the emotional brain back to the logical brain is bigger than in reverse. So many assume that our logical brain is more powerful than our emotional brain, but in real life and in practice, when neuroscientists went in and examined the connections between our emotional and logical brain, they found that the connections were much, much stronger going one way, coming from our emotional brain backwards, than in reverse. So this is really key to our lives, because our lives are ruled more by emotion than by logic. And every decision we make is kind of a combination or a balance between the two. And a very nice example of that is it's 3 in the morning. The young person is 20 years of age. They're out with their girlfriend. It's flogging rain, howling wind, freezing cold. They don't have a coat on them. And their logical mind is saying, for God's sake, will you go home and get the hell out of this, or you're going to get pneumonia? And their emotional mind is saying, l'amour. And I always say, the day it stops saying l'amour, I'm leaving Ireland. Okay? So I think it's key that our emotions will regularly overrule our logical brain. So when we're well, these two parts of our brain are in harmony. But when we're unwell, and this is where we get into difficulties, emotions can overwhelm the logical brain. And the classic example is depression. Another one is anxiety, particularly panic attacks. And a third one is suicide. And one of the ways in which our emotional and logical brains are connected, because they have to talk to each other, are through 3 mood cables, which are almost like little telephone cables running up between the emotional and logical brains. And we all hear about serotonin all the time. And out of 1 billion neurons, less than 50,000 neurons belong to our serotonin cable. So actually a very small number, even though we hear about this all the time. We hear nothing about serotonin. In practice, a very small amount of neurons are actually part of this cable. But it's a crucial one because it's involved in our mood, sex, sleep, appetite, impulsive behaviour. So when this goes down, for example, we get more impulsive and more self-destructive. Our noradrenaline cable is crucial for energy, sleep, drive and concentration. So you'll see later why these are important. And our dopamine system is involved in our whole sense of in food, sex and anything else that gives us pleasure. And it's also key, by the way, in young people in how they learn. So male versus female brain. This is really, really important. There are fundamental differences between both, and they're actually set up in the womb. So before you even begin, the brain is actually being already moved into either a female or a male kind of basis. So in general, men have slightly bigger brains, more neurons, but women are better connected. So men work out of the right or left side, the hemispheres, but they're inclined to be intensely logical or intensely emotional, which drives women mad. Women, on the other hand, can interconnect between both hemispheres and are well able to be both logical and emotional at the same time, which drives men mad. So men have fewer language and emotional centres than women. So when they're in difficulty, unfortunately, men will talk to themselves. But women will be more likely to talk to each other. So it's kind of nearly set up before we start. We often hear, why in God's name do men not come forth and talk to each other when they're in trouble? But we're already almost hardwired that way. And is this the key to male suicide? I think it's a key factor. So now we're going to move on to the 3 ages of the brain. So I think what's really important is that the brain is constantly evolving and changing from birth to death. But there are 3 big phases. The developing brain is covering the period between birth and 30. The mature brain, which I call the wise brain, covers the period between 30 and 65. And this is the phase where the brain has perfected its connections and pathways, making them as efficient as possible. So a key factor is here that the person who's 35 will do a job so much more efficiently than the person of say, 15. They'll both get the job done, but the person at 35 will do it so much more quickly and efficiently. The aging brain is from 65, and we could probably push that up to 70 now, where the brain begins to lose its neurons and connections from aging, with some potential deterioration in our mental functions. So let's look at the developing brain, because in many ways an awful lot of problems occur during this phase, and we'll see that with depression. So at birth, the brain is only around 10% formed, which is quite extraordinary, with sex hormones having decided whether it's going to be male or female. From 0 to 12, we can get this incredible explosion of new neurons and connections in the brain, which start to shape the future person. But at 13, the real fun starts, because the brain at that stage has this jungle of connections which are totally inefficient, and it knows that it's going to have to try and put a bit of order on them to just try and prepare the person to become an adult. So it starts at around 13 with the help of our sex hormones, and it begins to prune the connections. So it's like pruning a rose bush, and it begins at the back of our head with our visual area, and then moves into the center of our brain, which is our emotional mind, our emotional brain, and then moves on finally to our logical brain. And it only actually reaches, most of the work is done by 25, but the final connections or myelination only happens around the age of 30. So we're actually, our brain is actually only fully mature at around 30. So a key to this is this is ability of the brain to reshape its connections, though, is what helps us to kind of create emotional behavior pathways, which really decides who we are. This period, I think, is a key period. The period between 12 and 16 is, do you know when you plant? Suppose you go out and you buy a new plant and you plant it, and there's a certain key period of time where the plant is terribly vulnerable, where it hasn't rooted down its connections. It's not really settled. It is very vulnerable to things happening in the environment. Well, the brain between 12 and 16 particularly is highly vulnerable. And it's particularly vulnerable to substances. So smoking, alcohol, and drugs, particularly hash, can have a detrimental, a devastating effect. I'm doing some research at the moment for a book, hopefully will be out this year. And even I, who have known some of this work, I'm quite astounded at some of the information that's beginning to come out now. So they can have a devastating effect before the age of 15 in particular, because these pathways are being formed and are key. So what happens is they increase greatly our chances of developing illness like depression, psychosis, and addiction. And what about other factors? We'll be coming back to some of those later. We'll be coming back particularly to depression later. But just to tell you that, for example, if you drink really heavily before the age of 15, you have 5 times the chance for starters of developing major depression. That's just for starters. So other crucial factors in healthy brain development are diet, exercise, and learning how to open up and deal with our emotions. And negative factors like bullying in any form, and again, I'm doing a bit of work on this, looking at this at the moment. Bullying and severe stress during this key period of time can absolutely cause chaos and set up real trouble for the long term. So these are the kind of stress triggers that we have to worry about. Any form of abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, invalidating environments, all of those, any form of significant abuse can really harm the developing brain. Bullying in any form, especially, funny enough, peer bullying, is very destructive. And a big, big issue at the moment is cyberbullying and text bullying. Very often in relation to sexual matters. For example, suggesting the person is homosexual, for example, would be a typical, even though the person may not be homosexual, but just putting it out there might be enough to destroy a young person and turn their brain into real negative mode. I think it's important to really stress, I've had a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. The 13-year-old tried to hang herself. The 15-year-old took a massive overdose of paracetamol and then went down and took another one to make absolutely sure. In both cases, they'd been cyberbullied for about 3 months. Their parents were totally unaware, and the destruction it was causing in the lives of these two children, it was incredible. And I have to say, one of the scariest things I've heard in the last 5 years was a little 13-year-old who, when I asked her, would she not have talked to her mum about it? And she said, well, to be honest, I didn't want to upset my mother. So it was easier to hang myself. So I think it's key that we understand that these do affect these young people and their developing brains, and can do so in an incredibly negative way. I think loss is a very, very important one, particularly traumatic loss, say losing a person to suicide or losing a person to a road traffic accident, or losing a key relationship. For example, mother and father separating at key times, of one person getting separated can be a key thing. I think lack of hope, which is an interesting one, due to difficulties with gaining employment and long-term prospects, can be a very important one. Exam pressures. Remember, most young people are either trying to conform or perform. They conform because of their peers, and they perform because of their parents. Thought for the day. Misuse or abuse of alcohol and drugs, which we talked about. Poverty and growing up in disadvantaged homes can be very significant. Loss of identity of the young Irish male, I think, is something we all need to think about. And loss of belief in traditional structures and political and civil structures. Our young people are totally cynical, and can we blame them? We haven't left them much to be positive about. I think increased rate of family breakdown is a key issue. The number of separations in the last 10 years is unbelievable. Young people get very, very caught up in these and very destroyed by them. I think this is the next one, is a key one, an increased move into the world of technology with all its potential risks. Because these kids are losing themselves in this world. There are major issues as well with body image in both boys and girls from as early as 12. And I think the last one is an interesting one. A reduced resilience due to overprotection by well-intentioned parents who want to protect them from life. So I'm just going to quickly go through depression itself. Firstly, I think it's important to distinguish between the emotion depression, which we all get. A common, simple human emotion. We get it when somebody dies, or relationships break up, or things are not going well in our lives. And I think what's a key thing in the developing brain, young people feel emotions far more strongly because their emotional brain is, remember, in hyperdrive, and their logic brain can't switch it off. So if they have a breakup, it's the end of the world. It's far more intense. All their emotions are more intense. However, depression with a big D is a different animal. And this is where we get a classical combination of physical and psychological symptoms. It affects around 15% of the community, possibly around 400,000 people in Ireland, although nobody really knows because half of them will never look for help. Many will suffer in silence. Many of our young people under 35 suffer in silence. Some will self-harm, around 60,000, and some will die. Figures are always quoted around the 500. Certainly myself and many others believe they're closer to 600 to 650 per year. And about 80% are men. And by the way, depression affects women 2 to 1, which is an interesting. I'll just go through the symptoms. I'm sure most people here know these, but I'll go through them. Low mood is not just having a bad day or a bad week. It's like being in a dark hole, down a dark well, where you're looking up at the sky and you wonder how in God's name you're going to climb out of the darkness to see the light again. And many people would describe it as a deep emotional pain, much worse than childbirth. Anxiety is kind of like often like an agitated anxiety. Fatigue is just this total exhaustion. It's not just, again, being tired. It's this mental exhaustion where you just cannot find, you don't know how you're going to, when you get up in the morning, you're going to see to the end of the day. Poor concentration is one I'm very interested in. I think we actually miss this completely in depression. Concentration is all about our cognition, which is our ability to kind of focus attention on things, to remember things, to problem solve, all these kind of issues. But poor concentration is very easily found out by asking the person, can they read a newspaper? Because if you're very down, you'll often find that the person can read it, but can't focus on what the words mean and can't put them into a kind of so they'll kind of throw it down. Now this is a key one, because if you're a student, a young person, then of course you may end up in difficulties because you're not going to be able to follow your studies. And then people call you lazy, and then you find yourself rating yourself as even more worthless than you already do. Poor memory is very important because people with depression, their memory is affected, short and long term. Sleep difficulties, particularly going to sleep, but particularly waking up around 4 or 5 in the morning, because your dream cycle in depression is turned back to front. Your REM, your dream sleep, is literally turned around back to front. And that means that we normally do all our dreaming in the second part of the night, but because the person's not able to do that, they wake up and they can't go back to sleep. Loss of drive, including sex. Loss of appetite, binge eating. Be very careful for watching for loss of appetite in young people. It might be the only thing you'll see. Weight loss and loss of appetite in a young person that might tip you off that they're in trouble. Negative thinking is why depression is such a problem, because when the emotional brain goes into negativity, it turns everything into kind of a sense of darkness. In other words, it looks at everything through a black veil. So often young people and older people will feel that there's no point in anybody even coming near them, because they're absolutely of no value or of no use. They feel there's no hope for themselves, there's no hope for the world, no hope for those around them. So their thinking can be incredibly negative. Loss of self-esteem is a key one. The person feels worthless. I also would be a cognitive behaviour therapist, so one of the key things here is that the person feels, I have no worth. Loss of enjoyment in life is key as well. Young people will tell you they're sitting in a crowd and they don't know why they're there. They're not enjoying anything that's going on around them. And suicide thoughts are key. And I think what's important is that the only mistake we can make in depression is not asking for suicide thoughts. And it's the way you ask that matters. So if you have somebody close to you and you're worried about them, never be afraid to say, look, if you're feeling a bit down, it's extremely common to get thoughts of harming yourself. Because what you've done is you've normalised it. That's key. I think there's a big difference, though, between suicide thoughts, which many people with depression will get, and genuine suicide planning, where the person has, like I had one lady walked up and down my surgery for a week. She told me, trying to decide would she turn right into the river or left into my surgery. Or a person might be talking about looking at that rope in the garage, or I'm collecting pills. Or I've had people talking about driving along and getting a very strong urge to turn the wheel into a wall, into a tree. So I think this is key. Most bouts of depression only last between 6 and 12 months. There is this image out there that everybody who is depressed for life. That's it. And because there is that common misconception, depression, I think, is getting a much worse name than it really deserves. I think it's a recurrent illness, but most people will only have between 1 and 3 episodes on average in their lifetime. It's only a small number of people who will have persistent recurrent bouts, probably around 20%. And they're often the people that everybody else regards as the ones who suffer from depression. But in fact, loads of people will just get simply 1 to 3 episodes. But a key thing is that the more often we get depressed, the more often we will get further episodes. And that's because of changes in the brain. I think it's important to have a particular statement about spotting depression in the under 25 group, particularly in boys. You can't see emotions, that's the problem. But you might notice tiredness, falling behind in studies, maybe memory issues and concentration issues. Loss of weight is a key one for me, or sudden increase. Any form of self-harm, increased use of alcohol, or any form of impulsive, angry behaviour, especially in boys. And watch out for students who are being bullied and moving quickly, because I believe some students are dying because of the consequences of feeling totally hopeless, that they can see no way out of their situations. And I think those 2 young children that I talked about were typical examples of this. Can you hear me still? Yes. Yep, can't. This is, for me, I'm just going to talk briefly on the treatment of depression. This is something I feel very strongly about, that at the bottom of this pyramid is lifestyle changes and empathy. Because I hear too much going on all the time about this constant confrontation between, do I use drug therapy or talk therapy? We've got to start with the basics, which is lifestyle changes and empathy. Because if you don't have those, in my opinion, you're going to really struggle. So just briefly looking at the treatment of depression. I think this is best done with a package. And the first one is empathy. Now, empathy is the ability to sense where a person is at from an emotional point of view. And it gives them the freedom to open up and express or talk to you about how they feel. A very good example of empathy is you go into your local supermarket and you meet this lovely girl and she fills your bag for you and she chats away to you and you go off and you have this great feeling of warmth and you say, what a lovely person. And the following day you meet her alter ego, Mrs. Grumps, who fires the thing at you, throws the change at you, never looks at you all the time she's talking to you. You've had a positive and negative empathy experience. Now, if a person with depression is hypersensitive to a negative empathy experience. So if they open up and somebody doesn't relate to them or doesn't empathize with them, they'll close down instantly. On the other hand, if they have a positive empathy experience where they feel this person senses where I'm at emotionally, they will open up. And that might be the opening up that saves them in the long run and helps them to get assistance. So I think everybody has this capacity, but we need to spot it in ourselves and try and improve it in ourselves. Lifestyle changes for me are key. Exercise should be the heart of any treatment of depression. 30 minutes of exercise a day. No matter how the person feels, you try to encourage them to exercise. And I will often notice that people who come back to me, who've got back into difficulties, have fallen away in their exercise regime. And I try to get them to do this for life. Not just when they're depressed, but for life. Diet, I think, is very important because people, when they're down, eat rubbish, total rubbish. And they eat very high sugar things, and they take a lot of high caffeine things, like chocolate, coffee, Coke. And all of these things are not good for our brain, and our brain doesn't function well. I think alcohol is a key, because the more you feel depressed, the more you drink. The reason you drink is to feed your dopamine system, and the more to try and get a little brief hit. But that only lasts for a very short period of time. And a person who drinks can feel depressed for up to 3 days. That's why some suicides happen, not necessarily on the night the person drinks, but within 48 hours of the person drinking, because it can lead to very acute sudden drops in mood and make them more at risk. So I usually, if I'm helping somebody, will look for their agreement to either cease or significantly reduce alcohol for a period of up to maybe 2 to 3 months until they're feeling better. Talk therapies are really important, particularly counselling, if there's any particular like relationship issues or bereavement issues or even addiction issues. I think counselling is very helpful. CBT, in my opinion, is a fantastic therapy if you're able to get your hands on it, because CBT is all about helping us change our thoughts and our behaviour, because it's our thoughts influence our emotions, which influence our behaviour. So if I think, for example, when I'm depressed, that I'm worthless, my emotion will be depression, and my behaviour might be to isolate myself at home, which makes me actually feel worse about myself, so I get into a kind of a negative spiral. So the therapist will challenge the thinking that I'm worthless and also the behaviour. And it's very, very effective. And a lot of evidence shows that if you have empathy, lifestyle changes, and drug therapy where necessary. Drug therapy has a very important place, and I think it's important to try to put it in its box. Drug therapy will not sort out life's problems, but what it will do if a person's very down is get them back up functioning properly, get them thinking better, get their energy up, their mood up, their appetite up, sleeping better, and the person is then better able to get involved in things like talk therapy, say for example CBT. So a combination, all the evidence shows, for example, the combination of CBT plus drug therapy plus lifestyle changes in the presence of empathy is the kind of package that will get most people really well quite quickly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just showing you that slide one more time, because I just want you to think of the emotional brain, the logical brain, and the connections. So what I'm going to have, we're going to just look at depression and the developing brain now and the causes, okay? So first thing to try to understand is that all the evidence now is showing increasingly that in the developing brain, particularly the person under 30, when the vast majority of cases of depression will first appear, most of them will start either in the mid to late teens or early 20s. And I think a very significant number of people will have had their first bout of depression by their mid-20s. That's not to say that other people won't get bouts of depression later, they will. But in relation to developing brain, there's this key period, say between around 15 and 25, when the vast majority of cases will appear. And the question is, well, why do people get depressed during this period at all? And all the evidence is showing now that it's probably a reaction to their stress system being overactive as they're growing and developing, changing their developing brain. And there's a lot of evidence showing that the more our stress system is overactive, the more our emotional brain is inclined to get negative. So what happens is a certain percentage of people are prone, through genes and upbringing, to their stress system being overactive and them not being able to be resilient to that. So they start to get depressed when life challenges hit them. And the typical things that hit them in their teens, as we've seen, are peer group issues, bullying, problems with sexuality, relationship difficulties, all those kind of issues. And then when they get a little bit older, coming into college, it's moving away from home for the first time, having to kind of cope with not having the support systems of their parents and friends around them, and being in a fresh environment. Some people will make it into difficulties if they move away and start a new job. And I really do have concerns about some of our young people who are moving away, maybe very early on, abroad, and we don't know how many of them are going to get on. So those kind of stresses and pressures can trigger the emotional brain to go into negative mode. And the real difficulty is that when depression hits, the person can't switch it off. So their emotional brain is in negative mode and their logical brain can't switch it off. And they get into difficulties. So most of them will present with the kind of symptoms that we've talked about already. In terms of treatment, I think what's a key thing is that you really have to separate young people from the ages of 12 or 13 up to, say, 18, 19, and those between 18, 19 and 30, because they are two completely separate groups. The person who's between 12 or 13 and 19, their emotional brain is running the show and their logical brain is really not getting much of a look in. and their emotional brain is extremely sensitive. So even using medications has to be done extremely carefully, and it should really only be done with specialist help. And there's a lot of work showing that, for example, CBT is not as effective, for example, in, say, young people in their mid-teens, which is not surprising, because if you think about it, if your logical brain is not fully formed, it's very, very difficult for CBT to be particularly effective. Now, the concepts of CBT can be helpful, but there's unfortunately increasing evidence beginning to show that using it, say, using this maybe in school populations may not be as necessarily effective as people might have thought. So a lot of work is often done at this group with family therapy and trying to kind of get family support systems up and running and try and deal with any particular issues that are going on, say at school or bullying or any of those kind of issues. Drug therapy is only used in a small percentage of cases, and the commonest drug here that's used is Prozac. I think when you get into the early 20s, I think you get into a new situation. The kind of difficulties the person are facing are different, and secondly, they become slightly more amenable to both drug therapy and CBT. So the older the person is getting, say into their 20s, the more effective these treatments may be. But in all cases, lifestyle changes are important. I think in terms of the course, I think it is very important that if we get bouts of depression starting, say, in the mid-teens, there's a lot of evidence of some groups that I would be involved with, that basically the earlier you get the person and the better you treat the depression at the start, the less likely it is to become a problem further on during their lives. So I do think it is very important that we start picking this up, particularly by the early 20s, because I think if it gets significantly, if the person keeps getting significant episodes and is not coming for any help, and these episodes will begin to unfortunately become more and more common because they haven't really got proper help. But remember, each episode, as we said before, will probably only last between 6 and 12 months. So what about the mature brain? Well, now we move into a totally new group of people. I think the causes are slightly different. Because when we move in from, say, 30 onwards, you find their brain is more mature. But they may already have had bouts of depression when in their teens or 20s. So the same predisposition will remain there. But the kind of things that may cause them problems might be different. For example, you may be inclined to see things like postnatal depression, you may see relationship difficulties, you may see financial problems, unemployment, or work pressures. They're all the kind of stressors that may trigger the mature brain into getting into difficulty. I think in terms of presentation, all the symptoms that we talked about will usually be present. I think the older the person gets, I think in some ways really the more, if the person is getting, particularly that 20% that are getting persistent bouts, many of them will become almost hopeless about it if they're not coming for proper help. So I think it's really important that we try and get them again early and try and treat them properly. Again, they will normally do quite well with lifestyle changes, exercise, CBT, etc. And I think the course, again, will depend on really if they get proper help early and quickly in an episode, it can be cleared up very, very quickly. So to move to the aging brain, which I think is actually should almost be regarded as a separate group altogether, because in many, many cases, the person may start developing depression for the first time, say over the age of 60, 65. They may never have a depression in their whole lives. So something is clearly different. There's no doubt that the group that get depressed in the developing brain stage and mature brain stage are nearly run into each other. You find the vast majority of people who get depression during the mature brain phase will probably have had some bouts of depression or some elements of depression in the developing brain stage. But people who develop depression for the first time, their causes may be significantly different. And I think if you remember back to the connections between the logical and emotional brain, what can happen is here that if you begin to get, say, small blood vessel changes in the older person, which begin to affect the connections between their emotional and logical brain, the person could begin to get depressed for the first time. And people who've had, say, strokes, even small strokes or large strokes, particularly affecting the left side of their brain, can also begin to get depressed for the first time. People will develop Parkinson's because the Parkinson's affects their dopamine system. They can get depressed for a totally different reason. So I think it's important that apart from people who get depressed for the normal reasons that we already discussed, where they have this predisposition during their lives, some of those will obviously continue to have depression as they get older. But I would be concerned sometimes that we miss depression in older people. I know if I go into many nursing homes, you can nearly pick out depression left, right and centre, and you know that nobody's picking it up. And the commonest reason why nobody picks it up is because everybody says, it's just old age. So people miss it. And many, many elderly people are quite miserable because we never pick it up, we never see it. So I think it's an area that we need to kind of look at. I think it's important that the treatment of depression in the elderly can be, again, extremely different because they don't seem to relate as well to treatments like, for example, talk therapies or CBT. They seem to be more reliant on drug therapy and lifestyle changes. And I think alcohol is a key one in older people because if they're drinking and they're down, it can really damage their brain a lot and make it very difficult for them to get better. The course of depression in the elderly can also definitely be more difficult, and you may find a person, because of their structural changes being created by, say, vascular changes or other causes, may be more difficult. So I think it's important that we almost regard this group as a slightly different group. So in summary, I think what I'd like you to kind of go away with the thought is that the brain will go through these different stages. That the young person, in my opinion, is where we need to probably target the first, because all the evidence is pouring out now that if we can get people during the developing brain stage, if we can get them to recognize depression, treat it properly, that the long-term effects of it running into, say, the ages between 30 and 65 and onwards seem to definitely be reducing. And I think we hopefully, within the next decade, I'm hopeful, may be able to kind of pick out a lot better young people who are in difficulties. We may even have tests to actually pick them out and try and kind of pin down people who are more at risk from those who are not, and treat them much more aggressively. Because I believe that in the long run, it's the early diagnosis and early treatment of depression in this age group that in the long run will actually hopefully lead to many, many people not having anything like the kind of difficulties they're having at the moment.